Hello everyone, my name is Alexander Smith and welcome to the presentation of my research paper entitled The Fight for Innovation in the Emergency Medical Services for the Applied Technology Capstone Course APT 410. So the Emergency Medical Services, or EMS, is a field that has grown far beyond its original roots. It holds a place of some respectability in the modern medical field, and standards really have changed drastically over time thanks to large amounts of evidence and research within emergency medicine that have changed how the field functions. Despite its current level of importance, though, it seems to be held back by many limitations, both external and internal to the industry. So the purpose of this paper is to discuss those challenges facing EMS, some of the changes I believe can move it in a more positive direction. We're going to talk about the application of technology within EMS, workforce development, leadership, financial challenges, and the future of the industry. So to give you a little bit of background about me, my name, again, is Alexander Smith, and I am a nationally registered paramedic. I have 5 years of experience working as a paramedic within an urban and rural 911 system, and then also about 4 years of experience of working as a paramedic within a law enforcement agency. I have advanced training beyond being a paramedic, including advanced training and certification through the American Heart Association, pre-hospital trauma life support, tactical medical practitioner, and tactical combat casualty care. So let's talk a little bit about the history of EMS. So Americans today are very familiar with the modern ambulance. Most people know what they look like, what they do, who works in them, how they function. But it was not always that way in the past. Today, when you can access the 911 system from just about anywhere in the United States, you'll most likely get a trained crew of EMTs and paramedics who will treat you and provide pretty much the same standard of care no matter where you are in the United States. But back during the inception of EMS, it was not that way at all. In fact, during the 1960s, which is not really that long ago if you think about it, most ambulances were actually funeral home hearses that were staffed by people who were completely untrained. They would simply go to these locations where emergencies were called in. They would scoop the patient up, load him in the back, and take him to the hospital. No pre-hospital training whatsoever. There was no EMTs, there were no paramedics or anything else of that kind. At the same time, however, the emergency rooms were pretty much in the same state of affairs. There were no dedicated emergency rooms in most hospitals. There were no specially trained emergency physicians or nurses. There was none of that stuff at all. It was a very haphazard system for the most part. So progression in the EMS has been incredible in some ways. A lot of this things due to something called evidence-based medicine, or EBM, which is a hierarchical system of evaluation of evidence, of medical evidence, in which different types of information and research come together to provide emergency medical practitioners and doctors and everything else with ideas of where the industry should go and what treatments work best and what treatments do not work at all, or perhaps what are just straight up dangerous. So to prepare for the future and maintain relevancy in respect to the medical community, EMS priorities need to be reevaluated, and cohesive reforms need to be made, especially in the areas of workforce development and technological integration. So the current technology EMS has a lot of limitations, but it has a lot of future needs as well. But we're going to talk a little bit about what the issue is with technology EMS as it stands right now. So, like with most 21st century organizations, technology in EMS drives progress. There's lots of types of technology available. There are scoop stretchers, there are splints, and there are things that are much more complex, like cardiac monitors, ultrasound machines, intraosseous drills, which are devices that allow for quick alternative options to IV access to provide medications and fluid and things like that. But as with anything else in the medical field, the main limiter is always costs. And there are a lot of issues with how finances within EMS affect the ability for EMS agencies to acquire these types of equipment. It would be ideal if every single ambulance could be equipped with the latest type of technology and the best trained EMTs and paramedics available, and unfortunately, the issues of cost to make it significantly hard for that to happen. Another factor in the application of technology EMS is the use of patient data and how that relates to continuity of care. So the continuity of care basically is the transfer of information about the patient and treatments and challenges presented between every step of the process, which this begins with the 911 dispatcher. It goes through to the EMTs and paramedics who arrive on scene, and then to the ER nurses, and then to the ER doctors, surgeons, etc., until the patient is ultimately transferred out or discharged from the hospital. The issue with that when it comes to EMS is that there's a tremendous lack of communication when it comes to these types of, when it comes to emergency medical responses within the emergency medical field. Basically, most of the time when someone contacts the 911 system for a medical issue, it is not until the paramedic actually calls the hospital that the ER is even aware that an emergency has occurred. So until there's some kind of advanced notification, that really doesn't happen, and there's not a great deal of communication and knowledge moving around while all this stuff is happening within a region of response. So there are some ways that this can be quick. This can be a little bit faster. For instance, there are some smartphone apps and other devices that allow paramedics to transfer pictures of, let's say, for instance, cardiac monitor readouts, which can indicate if a patient's having a heart attack. It can make the time that a patient arrives at the hospital and ultimately gets treatment a lot quicker. But these are not necessarily everywhere, and this is only one side of one type of emergency that paramedics and EMTs might respond to. So, according to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, by 2011, only 50% of U.S. states linked data between EMS and ER state systems. That means that in those states, only half of the states in the United States that actually linked that data, that data was simply was basically a way for EMS providers to say, hey, this is information that I have by the patient, transmit all the data across, and everybody can be on the same page. Very, very useful for large-scale trauma situations such as mass casualty incidents, large shootings, or fires and things of that kind. But that's only half the states in the United States that even had that capability. And unfortunately, according to that same report, the vast majority of those links in data systems is just used for the collection of data after the fact, which is something that is simply not sufficient for modern EMS. So let's talk about workforce development, management, and leadership priorities in EMS and how that is affecting the industry. So if you're up to date at all on modern management and organizational structure, you know that workforce development is a very important concept. It's becoming key to organizational success. So if you're examining EMS based purely on turnover rate, you would probably have the belief that EMS is doing a very poor job in this regard. Turnover rates in EMS are very high. They range between about 15 and 30%. And for paramedics specifically, it's about 24 to 30%, which is a 4-year turnover of an entire workforce for the average EMS agency. Comparing that to a similar field such as registered nurses, the turnover rate is about 15% for nurses, which is only half of that for paramedics. So the compensation for these practitioners and the nature of the work do play a role. Working on ambulances is a very stressful and frustrating job at times, but the main reason for me, in my belief, is the failure of EMS to develop the actual EMS workforce. EMS careers are very limited in nature. You can be, within an EMS agency, you can be a paramedic or an EMT on an ambulance, you can be a flight medic, and you can find some managerial spot or role within that agency. Very, very, very short ladder. Conversely, for nurses with a 2-year RN training and degree, you can become a nurse in an emergency room. You can be a nurse anesthetist. You can be a nursing practitioner if you go through more training. A BSN, pediatric specialties. There's multiple different rungs on that career ladder that provide you different options and avenues that simply do not exist in EMS. EMS just does not offer that kind of versatility. It's one of the main reasons why a change in career is one of the top reasons cited for turnover within EMS. So according to the book, Building Workforce Strength by Ron Elsdon, one of the best things he talks about there is training. And in the context for something like EMS, where emergency response requires a significant level of training to be able to provide care at a high level under high stress, most agencies, most companies, according to Ron Elsdon, simply do not provide training for long-term goals. They're always focused on the short-term performance goals. It's not very useful or conducive to long-term goals or workforce development. Especially applies in EMS, where training can be monotonous, it can be only about recertification, and it can have really often very little to do with very complex skills like endotracheal intubation, which require regular continuous training to maintain skill for something that is a fairly rarely used skill set. With many organizations, training is a matter of available funds and perceived necessity. But in the context of EMS, there is a tremendous side of that is critically necessary for not only workforce development, but also for the empowerment and strengthening of the workforce overall. And especially for EMS, it should be understood that training is an obligation. Medicine is always changing, and it's simply not acceptable for EMS agencies to remain stagnant when medicine is changing, and thus training is absolutely required to maintain your workforce up to date. On the financial side of the training and the equipment issue and data, there are certain limitations that are present and certain solutions that are possible, but not all the blame lies at EMS. One of the ways in which one area where the blame lies is how EMS agencies are compensated. So most reimbursement with EMS is done through Medicare, but unfortunately Medicare only pays for an ambulance bill if the patient is transported to the hospital. The issue is that EMS crews routinely treat things like hypoglycemia, which is low blood pressure or blood sugar, dehydration, anxiety attacks, choking, things of that nature, where patients often simply do not request to go to the hospital. And the issue is that the EMS crews can use time, money, and resources on these patients, receive no reimbursement for it, and that leads to a net loss for the agency that is providing that care. What that means basically is that for a lot of paramedics and EMTs out there, their higher ups, their managerial, betters, whatever you want to call them, they can put a lot of pressure on top of their crews to really get people to be transported to the hospital, even if they don't want to go or even if they don't need to go, which means that a lot of times you have paramedics and EMTs who are functioning just as much as caregivers as they are as accountants, trying to get people to go to the hospital for things simply because they know that without that transport, they will not be compensated. It's simply not a very ethical way of treating EMS providers and caregivers. It's not something that ER physicians or nurses have to deal with during their jobs. So according to available research, if we changed transport priority and allowed for refusals that were reimbursed, it would actually result in a large savings to the healthcare industry. It would reduce load on the ERs and would give EMS incentive to be able to provide care without having to be concerned about the financial loss associated with it, as long as Medicare could be reimbursed. And right now, especially when you consider the fact that in our current state of medical provisions in the United States, you don't have doctors routinely performing in-home care. It just doesn't happen very often. Ambulances and emergency rooms have taken on a lot of that responsibility, especially ambulances, and especially in impoverished areas where a lot of people don't even have a primary care physician. So clearly a modification to reimbursement practices is in order. And if these modifications were done, EMS agencies would have more capital available to provide for better training, workforce development, and technology integration. So let's talk about the failure of EMS to adapt in the context of the controversy about spinal immobilization. So EMS has come a long way, but in many ways it has really failed to adapt in changes in medicine and available evidence. And this is mostly evident in the use of the long spine board, or LSB. This is a large, rigid board that EMS providers use to extricate patients. Generally speaking, the patient is placed on the board, they're strapped down, they have a collar put around their neck, they're strapped in place. The idea basically is that if they have a spinal injury of some kind, it prevents them from moving around, thus prevents any kind of secondary spinal injury. It's logical, kind of makes sense. Problem is that for many, many years, the evidence has shown this is simply not effective. According to research done in 2016 and 2019, in two different medical journals, there's absolutely no evidence to support the fact that the idea that LSBs actually do anything to prevent secondary spinal injury. You might say, okay, well, that's in the past few years. Maybe in research back in the day wasn't quite so good. Maybe it said it was useful. Well, according to other research available in other medical journals, as early as 2002, there is absolutely no evidence to support using an LSB for spinal immobilization. But for 18 years, EMS has used these devices religiously without change. And there's simply no reason for it. It just doesn't make any sense. That debate aside, there's also an issue with how EMS providers and caregivers at certain levels, what kind of patient outcomes that they are experiencing. For instance, most ambulances are either staffed by EMTs who are EMT basics who provide basic life support, or BLS. Very few medications available to them, very limited training. And then on the other side, you have ALS ambulances, which are advanced life support ambulances, which are staffed by paramedics. They have all the drugs, all the advanced care, all the advanced training. You might think with the high level of care and training that ALS ambulances would have better patient outcomes, but unfortunately, that is not correct. So according to a report in the Annals of Internal Medicine 2015, that has simply not been the case. In fact, for most types of emergencies, including trauma, heart attacks, respiratory failures, and strokes, BLS units actually had better survivability rates, even out to 60 and 90 days, much better than ALS ambulances. That doesn't mean that money is completely wasted on ALS equipment and training. Just the study primarily covered urban locations in which you have very short transport times. So in rural areas where you have 1 to 2 to 3 hour transports, advanced care is going to be a lot more important. But it is a disturbing thing when you think about the fact that EMS is based a lot of its relevance, and a lot of its purpose, and its the movement of funds through the agencies on the fact that it needs more advanced training and care. But if it can't prove that it's useful, then how does it make any sense to provide that higher level of funding? So this does raise a lot of serious issues with EMS, but I don't want you to take from this the idea that I'm denigrating advanced levels of care or anything like that. I'm a paramedic myself. Actually, it comes down to a very simple thing, and that is a matter of training, discipline, and understanding exactly what within EMS provides better patient outcomes. So, according to available research regarding the use of EMS helicopter transports, which are staffed exclusively by highly trained paramedics and RNs, absolutely no EMTs or anything else of that kind. Helicopters across the board have better survivability rates than for patient outcomes than BLS or any type of ground level ambulance, period. So the reason for this, which in of itself proves some of the efficacy of this type of training and transport, is that helicopters do not remain on the scene. They arrive at the scene, they pick the patient up, and then they leave. All advanced care is done en route. There's a much shorter period of time provided. And that's one of the issues with these previous studies that were raised, is that BLS crews with limited interventions get everything done very quickly. ALS crews spend more time on scene than they shouldn't. So clearly this is a matter of training, discipline, and leadership, which is something EMS badly needs more of right now. So to future-proof EMS, I'm going to talk a little bit about what kind of changes need to be made, especially in the context of some information that I've read throughout my training courses here at USM from Dr. Linda Sharkey and Warren Barrett in the Future Proof Workplace. They talk a lot about what 21st century organizations need to provide 21st century changes and be more competitive. So right now, EMS obviously has a bright future, but its resistance to change is an issue. EMS needs advocates who will go before government bodies and demand better compensation for things that use up EMS resources, despite the fact that patients are transported or not transported. Training and workforce development are critically needed and need to be integrated in every single agency throughout the United States. And above all, patient outcomes should drive training priorities. If ALS is worse than BLS in its current training model, that training model needs to be wiped out and replaced with a better one. Absolutely. So EMS needs strong leadership. It needs a culture of patient-oriented training and treatment protocols. It needs the fostering relationships with hospitals and ERs, better communication, and much better technological innovation and application by far. With better EMS compensation for non-transport calls, better efficiency, we would have more opportunity for EMS to branch out a little bit. We could have things like community paramedics, who are paramedics that provide non-emergency in-home care and as a replacement to what house visiting physicians did back in the day. This would provide better screening services, especially in poor communities where going to an actual physician may be more difficult or impossible. With these future-oriented trainings and goals, EMS would be able to provide, and with better funding, EMS would be able to provide their crews with much better training and much better technology that would allow for futuristic EMS systems that much better than what we see right now. So, in their book, Great by Choice by Jim Collins and Morton Hansen, they describe a 10Xer as an organization that continues and thrives in a marketplace through risk-taking, preparation, and focused leadership. And I believe that EMS has the potential to be that type of industry with growth far beyond what its current role is, but it needs changes. Ultimately, EMS leaders need to push for a new era of EMS that learns from itself, and need to push EMS services to be better and more competitive every single year. With these changes, I believe that EMS can push beyond its humble origins, become something that is innovative and impressive, and something that everyone in the United States can be proud of. A service that truly provides the best qualities of 21st century medical care. So thank you for watching my presentation. I appreciate you. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you. If you have any questions about my presentation, please email me via my USM email, which is alexander.w.smith@usm.edu. Thank you for watching again, and have a great night. Thank you.